She used my name to cover his debts. I never saw it coming. My name, one I've worked my whole life to build, was dragged through the dirt, used by someone I thought I knew. Someone I trusted. The discovery didn't hit me all at once. It wasn't the kind of thing that crashes down in a moment of raw emotion. No, it was more like the slow tightening of a noose around my neck. Teresa's car wasn't where I left it, and the bank statements had discrepancies, small, but enough to make me look twice. It was only when I ran into Dominic, the accountant, in town one morning that the truth finally started to crystallize. "Damon," Dominic said, shifting from foot to foot, always looking around like he was afraid someone would overhear. He was a nervous wreck. "I saw something last week, in her accounts, something that doesn't sit right." I crossed my arms, sizing him up. "What kind of something?" He looked left, right, and then leaned in close. "Not my place to say, but she's been moving money around, paying off a lot of things. Odd stuff. Not normal. Not for someone who doesn't run a business or, do much with finances." I didn't flinch. I kept my voice level. "How much?" "Enough to raise eyebrows. I can give you the numbers if you want, but I'd advise you." Dominic hesitated. He knew better than to give me advice. He wasn't the type to question anyone who had more control over their life than he did. "You'll give me the numbers," I said, and he nodded before walking off, his face pale. I knew there was a problem, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it until I started checking things for myself. The first piece of the puzzle came the next day, when I saw the receipts. Teresa had been paying off a loan in her name, money that didn't add up with what she'd been making. What really caught my attention, though, was the lender's name. Trey. Trey. The florist. The guy with the warm smile and the soft words, who had been in and out of the house more than I cared to admit. Hell, I'd even helped him with a few things, never thinking twice about it. How could I? He was the perfect contrast to me, easygoing, calm, charming. I was the tough one, the one who didn't need to charm anyone. But my wife? She was a different story. I went to see him that afternoon, without a plan, but knowing that I had to get something straight. I couldn't trust the numbers on paper, so I needed to hear it from the horse's mouth. He was at the shop when I arrived, carefully arranging a bouquet. He looked up, surprised, but didn't stop working. "Damon, didn't expect to see you today. You're not here to buy flowers, are you?" I leaned against the counter, watching him work. "No, Trey. I'm here to talk about something else." He paused, the flowers halfway to the vase, and finally looked me in the eye. His face stiffened, and he set them down, wiping his hands on a towel. "What's going on?" "You know what's going on," I said, keeping my tone even. "My wife's been using my name to cover your debts." Trey's face went pale. "I don't know what you—" "Cut the act," I interrupted. "I've seen the paperwork. So why don't you tell me how deep this goes?" He took a step back. I was darting around the shop like he was looking for a way out. "It's not what you think. Teresa, we. I shot back, a hard edge in my voice. "You've got some nerve, Trey. I don't need you to tell me what I already know." His shoulders slumped. "She wanted to help. I needed it. It just happened." His voice was quiet, like he didn't want to admit anything out loud. I didn't blink. "You've made a mistake. I don't know how far you think you're getting with this, but it's over." He swallowed hard, trying to muster up something, but I could see the fear in his eyes. There was no fight in him, not with me. "Damon," he tried to speak, but I wasn't having it. I wasn't here for explanations. I was here for answers, and I already had more than enough. I stood up straighter, letting the weight of my silence fall on him. "You should have known better, Trey. Now you've put both of us in a corner." I never wanted this to happen. "I'm sorry. He faltered, and I cut him off again. "Save it. Go clean up your mess, Trey. It's over." And with that, I turned and left. I wasn't going to waste any more time on him. The pieces were in place now. I didn't need to hear another word. Teresa would find out soon enough what it meant to cross me. I didn't waste any time. The next few days passed like clockwork, methodical, deliberate. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of knowing that I knew. I kept everything normal, smooth. Like nothing was wrong. I could feel her watching me, though. The shift was subtle at first, those extra glances when she thought I wasn't looking, the way she started making excuses to leave the house more often. But I didn't change. I kept my routine, just like I always did. One morning, I walked into the kitchen to find her standing by the coffee maker, staring out the window. I could hear the hesitation in her voice when she spoke. "You're quiet lately. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I said, fixing my coffee. "Just busy. You know how it is." She didn't reply immediately, but I could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air, like she wanted to say more. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. I could almost see the gears turning in her head, but she knew better than to press. She'd learned by now that I wasn't someone who was easily read. If she thought she could play me, she had another thing coming. Later that day, I drove to the lawyer's office. We needed to move quickly. There was no telling how long I had before she realized she'd lost control. I sat across from Blaine, a seasoned lawyer who knew how to work the system without breaking a sweat. "You got the proof?" he asked, leaning forward, his fingers tapping on his desk. "Enough to make her sweat," I said, handing him the documents I'd gathered, the bank statements, the loan records, the receipts. "She's been using my name, Blaine. My credit, my reputation. She's been covering Trey's debts with my money." Blaine flipped through the papers, nodding slowly. "This is good. Real good. You've got leverage here, Damon. But it's going to get ugly. You sure you want to go down this road?" I didn't hesitate. "I didn't ask for this, but I'm finishing it. She won't get away with it." Blaine raised an eyebrow but didn't question me further. Instead, he reached for a file and started laying out the next steps. He didn't need to ask me if I was ready to handle what was coming. We both knew what was at stake. Back at the house, Teresa was acting like everything was fine, but I could tell she was on edge. It was in the way she moved around the house, in the way her eyes kept darting to the front door, like she was expecting someone. That evening, I decided it was time to make her feel what it was like to be on the edge, just like she'd made me feel for months. I took her car keys while she was in the kitchen, not even trying to hide it. I moved her car again, this time parking it several blocks away, right next to an empty lot. Then I watched. I didn't need to do anything more. By the time she realized her car was missing, I was already in the office, waiting for her call. "Damon." Her voice was shaky on the phone. "Where's my car?" I don't know, Teresa. Did you forget where you parked it?" I let the silence stretch out, just a moment to let her wonder if I was as clueless as I sounded. "I swear I parked it here." There was panic in her voice now, and I felt a small sense of satisfaction at how quickly she was unraveling. "You should probably check again," I said, and hung up. I stayed on the line for a few minutes, letting the uncertainty settle in. It was small, what I was doing, just a little mind game, but it would get to her. I knew it would. It wasn't about being petty. It was about showing her that I was in control. She couldn't even trust her own memory anymore. It was the first step in a longer game, and she was already playing right into my hands. Later that night, she came home, looking exhausted and confused, like she hadn't slept in days. I didn't say anything when she walked in. I just gave her a nod and kept reading the paper. "You did this, didn't you?" she said, her voice tight. But there was an edge in it now, an edge that wasn't there before. She was trying to hold it together, but she was already unraveling. "I didn't do anything. You misplaced your car. Happens to the best of us." I didn't look up from the paper. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "You're playing some game, Damon. You think you can scare me? It won't work." I finally looked at her, locking eyes. "I'm not trying to scare you, Teresa. I'm just showing you what happens when you lose control." She clenched her fists, but she didn't respond. She couldn't. I had already won this round. Over the next few days, the cracks started to show. Teresa's routine became erratic. She left the house more often, her phone glued to her hand. She would pace the house, and when I'd catch her looking at me, her eyes would dart away quickly, like she wasn't sure what to expect anymore. It was working. I didn't need to push her any further. The paranoia was eating her up from the inside. And that was only the beginning. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next. Teresa's nervous energy was becoming more palpable. She was careful, always looking over her shoulder, as if she expected me to snap at any moment. But I didn't. I kept everything in check, every move calculated. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me falter. I met with Blaine again, the lawyer. This time, I didn't wait for him to start the conversation. I laid out my plan. "I'm going to take her down, Blaine. But I need to hit her where it hurts the most, financially. We freeze everything. No warning, no second chances. Let her feel the ground fall out from under her." Blaine leaned back in his chair, hands folded. "You know what this could cost you, right? If she's got anything hidden, it'll come out, and it won't just be her. Trey too. You sure about this?" "I'm sure. She used my name, my reputation. And Trey? He's been playing a game with the wrong person." I paused for a moment, considering my next move. "I want her to know it's over. I'm not just taking back what she's stolen. I'm making sure she has nothing left to run to. Blaine's eyes narrowed. This is going to be a hard fight, but it's your move. I walked out of his office, not feeling the weight of the decision, not yet. But I knew this was it. The game was on. Teresa didn't notice the shift at first. I made sure of it. I kept things normal, almost too normal. But by the time I started freezing the accounts, the air in the house felt different. Her calls started becoming more frantic, her tone more defensive. It didn't take long for her to notice the changes. One afternoon, she was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her phone, tapping the screen like it was going to make the problem go away. She looked up at me as I walked in, trying to hide the panic behind her eyes. "Why did you freeze the accounts, Damon?" I stopped in the doorway, not giving an inch. "You're asking me that now?" Her hands gripped the phone tighter. "This is ridiculous. I need access to the money. You can't just—" "I can." "And I did," I said, cutting her off. "You've been playing with fire, Teresa. And now, I'm taking control." Her voice rose, desperation creeping in. "You're being unreasonable. I need this. I've got things to take care of. You don't understand." "I understand just fine. You've been covering up your mess for months, and now it's mine to clean up. You're not in control anymore." She stood up, her voice shaking. "I didn't want any of this to happen. I didn't." "Then you shouldn't have put yourself in this position. Now deal with the consequences." I turned and walked toward the door, leaving her standing there, speechless. That night, she was distant. I could feel the tension in the air, thick as smoke, but I didn't care. It was too late for apologies, too late for explanations. She had made her choice, and I was just following through on mine. I checked in with Dominic the next day, making sure the financial freeze was holding. He gave me a nod, confirming that everything was locked down. But I knew it wasn't just the money that would make her crack. I wasn't about to let this slide into something that felt too easy. No, there was more to be done. I started digging into Trey's background. He wasn't the romantic florist he pretended to be. I made a few calls, got a few answers, and what I found was enough to tie him into something darker. He had a history of debts, just like Teresa had tried to hide. But this time, I had the upper hand. It wasn't long before I saw them together. Trey was dropping something off at the house. I watched from a distance, my eyes narrow behind the blinds. They were too comfortable together, too open. She leaned into him like she couldn't help it, the same way she'd leaned into me when we first got together. That was the part that stung the most. She had replaced me with him, with someone who wasn't even half the man I was. But I didn't move on impulse. I stayed put, letting the moment pass, letting it sink in. I had all the pieces in place now. And when the time came, when it all exploded, there wouldn't be a single part of it that she could control. She thought she was clever, sneaky even. But I was the one with the real power. The plan was simple. I just had to wait for the right moment to bring it all down. And when it came, she wouldn't know what hit her. I didn't waste any time after I had everything in place. The documents, the bank statements, the proof of Trey's debts, everything was there. I could feel the pressure building, knowing that it was all about to come crashing down. But I wasn't going to rush. This wasn't about making a scene. It was about making sure they understood the weight of their mistakes. One morning, I came home early from the office. Teresa was sitting at the kitchen table again, this time with her head in her hands. She didn't hear me come in. I stood there for a moment, watching her. I almost felt sorry for her, but that would have been a mistake. She had made her bed. "Teresa," I said, my voice even, breaking the silence. She looked up, startled, wiping her eyes quickly like she thought I hadn't noticed. "Damon, I didn't expect you." "Yeah, I can see that." I walked into the kitchen and set my briefcase down, then leaned against the counter. "You've been busy, haven't you? With your little side project." Her face tightened, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "You don't understand. I needed help. Things got out of hand." "Out of hand," I repeated, my voice flat. "I don't think you understand the mess you've made. You've been using my name, Teresa, my good name, to cover Trey's mess." Her eyes flickered with panic, but she tried to hide it. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was just trying to get through. You don't give me anything anymore, Damon. I needed someone who—" I didn't let her finish. "Needed someone, huh? That's what you tell yourself? Because that's not what it looks like. You used me, Teresa, and now it's time to pay the price." She shot up from the chair, her voice rising in anger now. "You don't get it. I was lonely. I needed someone who could give me the attention I deserve. You're too busy for me. You've always been too busy. Don't even try to blame me for your choices, I said, stepping toward her. You made this decision. You chose him over me. You made the decision to drag my name through the mud for your own selfish reasons. She backed up a step, shaking her head. You can't do this to me, Damon. You can't just take everything away. I already have, I interrupted. You're out of options now. I've already taken everything you were counting on. Her face went pale. What do you mean? Everything's frozen, I said, barely keeping the edge out of my voice. Your accounts, your access. You don't get to play anymore, Teresa. It's done. She took a step back, her hand reaching for the counter to steady herself. No, you can't do that. We've been together for years. You can't just. You don't get it, I said. I'm done, Teresa. It's over. I'm taking back what you stole, and I'm not going to let you use me for your games anymore. She stood there, silent, her breathing shallow as if the reality was sinking in. I could see the confusion, the panic, but I wasn't about to back down. This wasn't about saving her. It was about setting things right. The lawyer's office was the next stop. I needed everything lined up perfectly. The financial freeze had done its job, but now it was time to pull the rug out from under her for good. I wasn't letting her get away with using me, using my money to cover Trey's debts. It wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was a betrayal of everything I had worked for. Blaine was already waiting for me when I walked into his office. I could tell by the look on his face that he knew I was serious. So, we're moving forward with this? He asked, his tone cautious but knowing. I don't have a choice, I said, throwing the last piece of the puzzle onto the table. She used my name to cover debts, but I'm not letting her walk away from this. I want her to feel it. I want to make sure she understands what happens when you cross the line. Blaine leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the surface of the desk. All right, Damon. We'll move forward, but we need to move fast. You know how these things go. I know, I replied. But she won't see it coming. She's already out of control. And by the time she realizes what's happening, it'll be too late. I left the office with a clear path forward. The accounts would stay frozen, and I'd make sure to hit her where it hurt, right in the wallet. I knew she wouldn't take this lying down, but I also knew she had no choice. She'd backed herself into a corner, and now, I was the one in charge. The fallout would be swift. The divorce papers would be filed soon enough, and I'd make sure she knew exactly what she'd lost. But the best part of it all was that I wouldn't have to lift a finger to make her suffer. She'd do it herself. She always did. The next few days were tense, but I didn't let it show. I kept my distance, stayed focused. Teresa was unraveling faster than I'd expected. She tried to play the victim, but her lies were thin, and every time she spoke, it was more obvious she was losing control. I had already filed for divorce, and there was no turning back now. I wasn't interested in reconciliation. She'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. One evening, she came into the living room, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes tired, but there was something else in her expression, something frantic. Damon, she said, her voice shaking, we can fix this. We can fix everything. I didn't look up from the book I was reading. No, Teresa. It's too late for that. Her breath caught, and she stepped closer, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Please, just listen to me. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was trying to fix things, to make everything work. I looked at her finally, my face expressionless. Fix things? You think you can fix this by using my name, running up debts, and dragging me into your mess? You've lost the right to even talk about fixing things. She swallowed hard, her eyes brimming with the kind of desperation I hadn't seen in a long time. I was lonely, Damon. I didn't have anyone. I needed something. I didn't know how to fix it. I put the book down, leaning forward slightly, my voice calm but firm. That's your excuse, Teresa? Loneliness? You went behind my back, betrayed me, and tried to cover it up. You don't get to play the victim now. Her shoulders slumped, and she backed away slowly, as if she hadn't expected me to respond like that. I don't know what to do, Damon. Everything's falling apart, and I'm scared. You should be, I said, standing up now, my voice colder. You've made your bed, Teresa. Now you lie in it. I'm done cleaning up after you. I walked past her, not sparing her another glance. I was done. A few days later, the legal papers came through. The court had ruled in my favor. The assets were frozen, and she couldn't touch anything. I knew she'd try to fight, but it didn't matter anymore. The financials were locked, and everything was set to come down hard. The lawyer had worked fast, and it was over. The paperwork was ironclad, and with Dominic's testimony about her hiding assets, the judge didn't hesitate. Teresa was left with nothing. I met with Blaine one last time to finalize the details. "It's done," he said, handing me the final documents. "The assets are yours. The court's ruling is solid. She'll have nothing to fall back on." I nodded, feeling a cold satisfaction. I want her to feel it. I want her to realize she's not the one in charge anymore. She won't get away with using me. Blaine leaned back in his chair, hands behind his head. "You've done what you needed to do, Damon. Now it's just a matter of waiting for her to come to grips with it." And that's what happened. Teresa tried to make a scene, but it was too late. Her assets were frozen, her name was tarnished, and the only thing she had left to hold on to was Trey. And even he wasn't going to save her now. The first time I saw her after the ruling was in court. She looked smaller somehow, defeated, sitting there across the room. There was no fight left in her. She had tried to look composed, but it was clear she was drowning. Trey was with her, but even his presence didn't give her the comfort she needed. He didn't have the power to help her anymore. I stood up and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. It didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. At home, I sat down at my desk, a sense of relief washing over me. It was over. No more lies, no more games. I'd fought for what was mine, and I'd won. Teresa and Trey were left with the wreckage of their actions, while I was free to move on. There would be no more meetings, no more negotiations. It was done. They had no place in my life anymore. I had taken back control, and I wasn't about to give it up. The phone rang. It was Teresa, of course. She wanted to talk, wanted to explain again, but I wasn't interested. I didn't pick up. There was nothing left to say. A week passed, and the silence was heavier than I expected. Teresa didn't try to reach out again, not in any meaningful way. Her calls had stopped. I assumed she was trying to figure out how to salvage whatever she could, but she had no ground to stand on. I wasn't going to give her a chance to make it right. There was nothing left to fix. The weight of everything lifted off me slowly, almost imperceptibly. The tension that had been eating at me for months, maybe even years, was finally gone. I could breathe again. I got back to work, to the things that actually mattered. My clients. My business. My future. The distractions were over. One evening, I went for a run. I hadn't done that in a while. The air was crisp, and the streets felt quieter than usual. My legs burned as I pushed myself harder, the rhythm of my footsteps grounding me, steadying me. I'd been carrying a lot of weight for too long, and now it felt like I was shedding it, one step at a time. When I came back home, I saw a familiar face waiting by the door. Trey. Of course. He'd been quiet for a while, but I knew he couldn't stay away forever. I wasn't surprised. "Damon," he said when I stepped up to the porch, his voice as calm as always, but there was something different about him now. Something resigned. He stood there, hands shoved in his pockets, avoiding my gaze. "I just want to say, I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I stared at him for a long moment, taking in the sight of him. He looked smaller than I remembered, more tired. Maybe it was the situation. Maybe it was just that I was seeing him for what he truly was. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" I said finally, a harsh edge to my voice. "You think that matters? You've crossed a line, and you think a sorry is going to change anything?" He stopped, his eyes flickering to the ground. "Look, I messed up. I didn't think this would go the way it did. I'm not proud of it. You should be ashamed of yourself," I said, stepping closer, my tone deliberate. "You used her, just like she used you. You both thought you could pull this off, didn't you?" Trey took a deep breath, his hands now tightening in his pockets. "Yeah, maybe I thought she'd leave you. Maybe I thought I could give her what she wanted." He paused, looking me in the eye for a second before turning his gaze back to the ground. "I was wrong. I get that now. You're not the one who has to fix this," I said, watching him carefully. "Teresa's not my problem anymore. You're the one who needs to deal with the fallout, not me. You've lost too. But you can't even see it yet, can you?" Trey stood there for a moment, as if he was about to say something else, but then he just shook his head. "I know. I get it now." He finally looked up at me again, this time more like he was accepting the truth than trying to fight it. "I messed up, Damon. I'll stay out of it. I'm done." I nodded, more out of practicality than anything else. "Good. You should have stayed out of it in the first place." Without another word, I turned and walked inside, shutting the door behind me with a finality that didn't need any more explanation. Trey had nothing left to say. The people who had caused all the damage had already been stripped of everything they thought they could hold on to, and now They would face the consequences of their choices. I sat down at my desk, the paperwork I needed to go through waiting for me. Everything was in place now. The divorce was final, the assets were mine, and I was moving forward. There was no point in lingering on what had been. It was time to focus on what was next. Teresa's calls had stopped. I knew she was still trying to find some way to make sense of everything, but she wasn't going to find an answer. There was no way to go back. The betrayal wasn't something you could undo. It was a line that had been crossed, and now the only thing left for her was to face the wreckage of her own making. The only thing that mattered now was me. What I had worked for, what I had earned. I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me. Not her. Not Trey. Not anyone. And so, I moved forward. My future was mine to build, and I was going to build it strong. A few months passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. The house, the office, everything was just as it should be, ordered, quiet, predictable. I didn't have to look over my shoulder anymore, didn't have to listen for the phone ringing in the middle of the night. Things were back in my control. I kept my word to myself. I didn't look back. Teresa and Trey faded into the background, like a bad memory that no longer had any power over me. And that was exactly how it should have been. They were nothing now. One afternoon, I got a call from an old friend, someone who had known me before all the mess. He didn't know the details, he didn't need to. He just knew something had changed. "You all right, Damon?" he asked, his voice a little hesitant. "I don't see you around much anymore." I chuckled, leaning back in my chair. "I'm good. Better than I've been in a long time." He didn't press for more, but I could tell by the pause that he was glad to hear it. "Well, if you're ever in town, you should stop by. The old gang misses you." "Yeah, I'll keep that in mind," I said. But I wasn't planning on going back to the past. I had no interest in reliving it. My future was all I cared about now. Later that week, I was out for a walk when I saw her. Teresa. She was standing outside a cafe, talking to someone, but when she saw me, she froze. Her eyes darted, and for a split second, she looked like she might come over, but then she stopped herself. I didn't acknowledge her. I didn't need to. She was a ghost now, nothing more. As I kept walking, I could feel the weight of it all lift off me. The chapters that needed closing had been sealed. The past didn't matter anymore. I wasn't going to waste any more energy on someone who had already shown me exactly who they were. The next week, I received the final piece of the puzzle, the financial settlement. It was done. The courts had made their decision, and there would be no more back and forth, no more drama. Teresa had gotten what was coming to her, and Trey? He was out of the picture entirely. They were left with nothing, no money, no future, nothing to stand on. And me? I was free. I had my reputation, my business, my integrity, and I wasn't about to let anyone take that from me again. As the lawyer had said during our last meeting, everything was locked down. The court had ruled, and the consequences were final. The years of hard work I'd put in were mine to keep. A few months later, I received a letter from Teresa. It was brief, and the words were carefully chosen. "I've learned a lot from this," she wrote. "I'm sorry for what happened. I'll never make the same mistake again." I read it once and tossed it in the trash. There was nothing more to say. The apology was empty, a last attempt to reclaim something she'd already lost. But it didn't matter. She'd made her bed, and I was long gone. I didn't dwell on it. I had other things to focus on. My business was growing, and I had people depending on me. The future was right there, in front of me, and I wasn't going to let anything or anyone get in the way of it. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic scene. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had come out on top, that I'd been tested, betrayed, and I'd handled it with the kind of calm strength that only comes from experience. The story had played out as I knew it would, and in the end, I had won. The best part? I didn't need anyone else to validate it. I didn't need anyone to tell me I was right. I knew it, and that was enough. So, I moved forward. Stronger. Better. And the past? It was just that. A part of the story that was already done.